Good morning to everyone. We still have a few more, I think, that want to sign on, but I want to make sure I stay firm to our timeline. This morning, we're covering the 9001, ISO 9001 Management Systems Overview. I'm Kurt Lopez, obviously your speaker today. I've been with Missouri Enterprise now for 26 years. Prior to that, worked with a couple of manufacturers, with defense contractors and paint manufacturers, and so I've been doing this kind of work for some time. I'm also a management system master auditor, have conducted audits on behalf of certification bodies. Missouri Enterprise, we're an ISO certified company. Our acting management representative. And in addition, obviously, I've worked with several clients pursuing and successfully achieving certification. So my goal today is to give you some perspective, not just as giving you this information, but also I'll roll in, this is what auditors look at or look for. And if you have questions along the way, please don't hesitate to ask. I want to make sure I cover those. So things I want to make sure I cover. So hang on just a second here. I'm not getting the slides to advance. Hang on just a second, I need to reboot this. All right, nothing like breaking the ice with a little bit of technical difficulties. All right, so what I want to cover today, things that you may have read whenever you signed on. I certainly want to cover an outline of the ISO series of standards, not just 9001, and holistically in terms of how they're numbered and how they're outlined and the benefits of covering that. Also, benefits of successfully implementing ISO 9000 quality management system. Other things I want to do is cover specifically a general outline of the intent of the requirements. Usually when I do an overview of all the requirements, that's usually 3 to 4 hours, and obviously we didn't allocate that kind of time, and I want to try to make this a little bit more exciting and more of an open dialogue. So the thing I want to make sure I cover is, what is the intent of the standard in the various sections, so you have a good feeling for what how to implement that. And as I work with companies, that's really how I try to approach things, is, what is the intent of these requirements or this section, so that as organizations understand it more thoroughly, they tend to do a much more thorough job, a better job of both understanding and meeting those requirements within their systems and their documentation. Other things I'll talk about is the certification process. It's a two-stage process. I'll talk about both stage 1 and stage 2 activities, what goes on within those. And then in addition to that, beyond ISO 9001, the benefit of integrating those management systems with other initiatives, other improvement initiatives. So, and then I'll end up with what's the next steps after that. So that's pretty much how I hope to address that. First slide here, just talk about meeting customers' expectation. What's the driver for ISO 9001 and for organizations? So, certainly the customer drive, and I say customers, whether it's the end user of our products or services, or whether we're supplying to our customers, meaning that they are OEMs or manufacturers as well. But what they're looking for is consistency, and that we have processes in place that we can replicate, and that's essentially what they're looking for. So global demands certainly require companies to demonstrate those abilities, and that's what the 9001 standard really does for us. Is it says, okay, we've gone out to a third party and they recognize that we have these systems in place, so that then as we look for either move into new markets or address existing customer requirements, then they have that confidence that we've got the process in place, not only to replicate and continue to do these things the same way, but also to improve. So we'll start with the management system focus holistically when we talk about management systems as a whole. When I say ISO defines management system as a set of processes, we're talking about not just the ISO 9001 standard, but as organizations continue to grow, sometimes they get into industries that may require that they have environmental management systems or ISO 14001 or occupational health and safety, which used to be ISO 18001, which is now ISO 45001. Or maybe you want to move beyond ISO 9001 to some of those, what they call sector or when I say sector specific, whether you need to go to automotive or aerospace or aviation, space and defense, medical device, or beyond that, then we'll talk about how that feeds into all those pieces there. But there was a significant shift in the year 2015 in that all of these different standards pushed to outline those sections, each section, so that they mimic one another. So as time goes on and you need to integrate these other, it makes it a lot easier for organizations to expand onto these other management systems. So the benefits of certainly implementing this, when I say from a leadership standpoint, is it makes better use or best use of resources. Certainly the focus of this standard and those other standards is the identification of risk or opportunities and the management of those. How do we handle that or address that or mitigate those risks? And then how do we use that to increase customer satisfaction by meeting our product or service expectations? So in general, things I want to tell you about. If you were to read these standards, and I'm not going to read them verbatim just to explain, but all of them begin by talking about whether it's 9001, outlines how organizations need to demonstrate their ability to consistently provide products that meet customer, applicable statutory regulatory requirements, those are also referred to as legal requirements, and where we need to enhance customer satisfaction through the application of our management system. Also includes process for continual improvement, assurance of conformity to customer and applicable legal requirements. So this outline here really kind of came from the 9004 standard. When we talk about, there's a reference to the ISO 9001 series of standards. There's the ISO 9000 document that really is guidelines in terms of definitions. So if you have any question about some of the language in the 9001 standard, you can go to the 9000 standard. It'll give you a description or definition. And then there was this 9004 document, which used to be considered the guidelines for performance improvement. And so this particular pictorial here was extracted from one of the earlier versions of the 9000 piece, but I think it's still relevant today, where most organizations begin as you have your own departments and you're operating within your whether you're working in purchasing or production or engineering, when folks start out, they typically have their processes and they're working within their, what I say, functional silos. Now, as time moves on, then, we recognize that there's a handoff of whether it's information or raw materials or, whatever the case may be, then, at some point we recognize there's this integration and how we have a much cleaner handoff of these activities. And I can tell you from a auditor perspective, what happens is auditors look for to make sure there's a clean handoff of information from one department to the next, or they want to make sure that things aren't inadvertently falling through the cracks. And you'll hear me talk about that more as we proceed forward. But that's really when you get in that stage too, you start to recognize this, flow and handoff of activities, whether it's throughout production interdepartmentally or as we hand off information from engineering perhaps to purchasing, or as we plan for production activities in those activities. So when we get to stage 3, then that's where we're really focusing more on integration and a clean handoff of those activities. And obviously at stage 4, that's where we talk about that extending that integration efforts to our suppliers and customers. In the next few slides, I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. We'll talk about the management principles and what those mean and how that's interrelated here with these activities. So, real benefit is really gained. There's a lot of drivers for why companies want to become certified. Anywhere from, sales has an opportunity to move into new markets if they become or can demonstrate that they're certified, which is certainly one of the benefits. Other benefits are what I like to see as more holistic benefits, are those companies who want to use these requirements, and actually they're considered best practices within their own organizations to kind of help become more efficient, obviously to increase quality. And it's really the combination of those activities that really help an organization to get the most bang for the buck or the most benefit for implementing your management system and becoming certified. So, for companies that are considering becoming 9001 certified or to certify to any management system standard, there's obviously you have to do this cost-benefit analysis. So, I mentioned to you have these external reasons for why you need to become certified, whether it's through your customer or the markets you're in, or maybe you want to move into a new market, but which is typically a driver, but there has to be some measure of what's my return on investment, or what's the reason why I want to go down this path. So, certainly there's short-term benefits as you gain those extra customers, but the longer-term benefits are really as you implement the standard and you really use it to drive improvement, to really kind of flush out and become more effective, more efficient, minimize scrap, rework. And so if those are things, and usually when I work with clients on these projects, I always tell them, these improvement initiatives are on the table for however long the scope of the project is. And the reason why I say that is because, we don't want to implement bad processes, but so if there's opportunity to implement improvements, then we want to do that along the way, and all those are on the table. So those organizations considering 9001 certification, you have to do that benefit analysis and decide, is this going to work for me, and what's that return on investment. So this next slide really kind of outlines, just at a high level, where those benefits can be gained. So if you look to the the left side of the screen, where you implement the standard, then there's increased process control, quality of your products, productivity, efficiency, and essentially you'll gain greater, you'll lower your costs. Hopefully you'll increase your profitability as a result of that. But then if you look to the right hand side, those other benefits, so your access to your new markets, as you heard me mention before. But in all these things, there's this expectation of continual improvement. We'll talk about that in more detail as we get into some of the requirements of the standard. So, the real focus for management systems, and specifically for quality management systems, is this integrated process approach. That's been the big push for the last couple versions of the standard. And really, as we understand, how do we capture the voice of the customer, if that's through sales and marketing efforts or customer service, whatever you call those departments or functions, and the handoff of those activities, if we have design as part of our processes, then how does those input become or drive some of the designs? And then also how do we hand that information off as we're planning for customer requirements and fulfilling those? So the second bullet point talks about this international research and consensus of 8 management principles. 9001, for every ISO standard there is a technical committee, and TC 176 happens to be the one for ISO 9001, and these 8 management principles really just kind of represent, what do we want to achieve, what's the end goal in mind. And so these principles really kind of represent where we want to be, or how we want these standards to play out. So there used to be 8, now there's 7 management principles. Certainly customer focus, obviously it should be driven by who's our customer, and making sure that we're agile and we're meeting those customer demands. And so if we put together our processes so that we can be more efficient, more agile, then obviously there's business to be gained. And the second one talks about leadership. Obviously leadership, top management, they should be the ones that tell us, where do we want to be next year, or in 3 years, or 5 years down the road, and how are we going to measure if we're heading in the right direction, or if we need to make adjustments. And so that really is top management's responsibility to make sure that the employees throughout the organization understand that, so that if you have second shifts, or if you have a third shift, and there's less management around, and they understand very clearly what the drivers for, what leadership's looking at, then they can make those informed decisions that would be consistent with where leadership wants to go. The next one talks about involvement or engagement of personnel. I always tell clients when I work with them, I want to work with the process owners, because ultimately, we can create documents, procedures that fulfill the requirements of the standard, but if they're not embraced, if they don't make good business sense throughout the organization and they're not being utilized, then that can cause as many problems for us than if we don't fulfill those requirements. So at some point we need to make sure that everybody's engaged, everybody's using the standard, following those. And as I work with clients, I always tell them, the best thing we can do, the ISO standard isn't a set of requirements that we need to retrofit our organization to. The best way to implement the standard is to just demonstrate how do we satisfy those requirements within our four walls, within our processes, so that the closer that our documentation meets our efforts, then it's a lot easier to follow and therefore minimizes the risk for any longer term non-conformities or things that could cause problems. Process approach. You'll see in the next coming slides that we talk about the process approach, but then again we're talking about the handoff from customer service sales to production planning or to purchasing or to engineering, and then from that the handoff of those activities for either incoming inspection or as we release product for production, or if we're providing services, how do we initiate those pieces. But that's really what this process approach, desired result is achieved more efficiently when resources and activities are managed as a process. And again, you'll see other examples of that as we move forward in these slides. So if we understand very clearly what the inputs are or the outputs are to a certain process, then that gives us, okay, what do we want to measure, what do we need to measure that tells us whether or not we're doing this most effectively and we're meeting those handoffs or to our internal customers. So once we understand more clearly what we need to monitor, that's where that improvement comes in, or that step 5, so that as we recognize and we look at trends, then that tells us where we can make adjustments or where there are improvement opportunities. So that leads into that 6th bullet point, that evidence-based decision making. A lot of folks make these decision improvements based upon gut or what they've witnessed or feel like this. So this kind of substantiates, hey, we've got some real evidence that really tells us what's working, what's not working, or where we can focus our improvement efforts. And then we get to that 7th piece, that relationship management. I always talk to organizations and say, we can do things perfectly within our four walls, but if we get bad information or bad raw materials coming in the door and we don't have accurate information, then we're never going to get good product going out the door. So that's where at some point we need to recognize, our suppliers are as much a partner to us, getting us the right stuff on time and meeting our customer requirements to really fulfill and gain all the there is to get all the benefits for implementing the system. So again, we talk about this process approach. Whether that center arrow where it talks about activities, whether that's again customer service or purchasing or engineering or production. But again, what are the inputs? Whether it's the raw materials, components, whether it's the information that comes in. We need to make sure we're capturing all the right information. And then we either we process that information or we process raw materials or components, and then the output of that would be the handoff to the next person in line, whether it's throughout the production process or finished goods or the warehouse or shipping. Then we need to understand what those inputs and outputs are, and the better job we do about that, then the more effective our system can be. I can tell you that as I've worked with clients in this piece, many times we recognize there's a lot of redundancies that happen or occur. And so where we see maybe early on, hey, we capture the same information over at this point, and rather than collecting the same information at another point down the road, why don't we just share that information to help minimize that redundancy? And so there, a lot of times there's improvements to be gained and efficiencies just by going through this process. So when we talk about the process approach, ultimately the ability for organizations, your companies, to consistently provide the high quality service and product is that really focused on efficiency. You'll see when we move down the slides, we have to have a quality policy, measurable objectives, and when we finish or become successfully certified, I always tell the clients that I work with, this is really kind of the end of the beginning. We've done this to demonstrate to our customers, to our new markets, that we have fulfilled these requirements. So what's the next step? Well, what are those improvements that we can implement now that can help our profitability or make us more efficient? And so then, it's really kind of the beginning of the journey, and we can now focus on some of these other improvement initiatives. So, in general, if you were to look at any section or list of these standards, Section 1 is always, you're going to see there's 10 sections of the standard. And as I told you before, all ISO standards except for the medical device standard really follows this outline so that it's easier to integrate. So the first section talks about the scope, what are the intended outcomes of your management system, and the outcomes are, so talk about industry specific. It should be aligned within the context of the organization, and you'll hear me talk about that more in sections 4.1 and 4.2. And then when you get to clause 2, talk about normative references. That's where, if you were to look at the 9001 standard, it would reference the 9000 document that talks about definitions or, for terms that's used within that particular standard. Clause 3 also further, expounds upon those terms and definitions. So such things that might seem straightforward as, what does the standard mean when we talk about leadership or top management? Well, that could be different from one organization to the next. I've worked with organizations that may have 15 different facilities, and they're covered under one certificate, in which case, as you can imagine, top management would be at that corporate level. Whereas I've worked within other organizations that each manufacturing facility acts autonomously, and they're responsible for getting their own certification. And so leadership is really who's at the highest level at that location. So that kind of helps, some organizations try to determine, how do we want to sort out, do we want to be covered within one certificate, or do we want to be handled or broken out into separate different certificates? So there's benefits and potential pitfalls for both of those areas. We get into section 4 of the standard. Talks about understanding the organization in context. And again, as I said, that's part of every one of these standards we talk about. Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. Once we've gone through those first 2 steps, then determining the scope or what's the magnitude of our management system. And then section 4 talks about then all the requirements of the management system or what needs to be achieved as a whole. Section 5 talks about leadership's responsibilities, their commitment, their responsibility for creating quality policy, and leadership's responsibility for defining organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. Section 6 talks about, how do we identify risks, how do we address those risks, and we'll talk about that more when we get into the 9001 requirements. And then management system objectives and planning to achieve those. So again, for all these management systems, there's an expectation that we have, whether it's the quality policy or an environmental policy or an occupational policy, but all of those have these requirements for a policy, and then how are we going to monitor and measure whether we're heading in the right direction. Section 7 really talks about resources at a high level, and then not only resources where we talk about human resources, but also infrastructure, work environment, those pieces, and then competence. How do we determine the competency that's necessary for each of these requirements? Awareness, communication of these of all these resources and of the documentation. And section 7.5 talks about documented information. When we get into section 8, that's operational planning and control. You'll see in 9001 that becomes much more extensive than in some of the other standards. Section 9 talks about our monitoring, measurement, analysis, improvement activities, including internal audits, and how does that information make its way into management review so that leadership can make informed decisions about how's our system working or where are there improvement initiatives. And then where we identify those improvement initiatives, then section 10 really kind of kicks in. How do we determine and select those opportunities? How do we handle non-conformities or corrective action process, and how does that drive continual improvement? So as I said, for all the ISO standards, they're all broken out in those 10 sections. Now, this next slide is really just to try to depict what are those additional requirements specific to 9001. So the next pieces you see here talk about, okay, within planning, within support, and within your your evaluation sections, those additional pieces are requirements specific to 9001. And then in section 8, you'll see the next slide, there's much more information that comes into play with 9001 requirements. So it's not only the planning, but then determination of products and processes or customer-related activities. Then we get into design development activities, from design development, then purchasing or control of our external providers. And then we get into production-related activities, and then once we get past production, how to release products, or what happens if we have non-conforming product. All that should be covered within section 8 of standard. As I told you before, section 9 is how we evaluate that. Section 10 is going to be where we have improvement initiatives. So I'm going to briefly discuss, within each of these areas here, just at a high level, what those requirements are. So when we talk about context of the organization, specifically in section 4.1, the standard says that the organization shall determine their external and their internal activities. So that sounds fairly openly written, but for those organizations, and actually what the standard really focuses on is how do we integrate our management system. I make mention, rather than calling it a quality management system, a management system, because it really is more than just a quality function. It really is about the whole organization. And this version of the standard really focuses on making sure that the organization's management system supports the overall strategic direction. So when we get into section 4.1, standard talks about organization shall determine those external or internal issues. And for those companies that have a formal strategic plan, then somewhere in that they probably have performed like a SWOT analysis where they would have identified what are those internal, what are the things we do good internally, what internal weaknesses do we have, so that we have a good feel for, where's our niche, where's our market, where's our sweet spot, or where there are things that we can improve, so that ultimately externally we would identify whatever threats or opportunities are in place. So that's the first step, is we have to go through that exercise. Then once we've determined, what markets do we want to go after, then section 4.2 says, okay, the organization needs to identify those interested parties, which would include customers, perhaps the industries we serve, and those industry-specific requirements certainly would include, could include employees, depending upon where we're at. I've had manufacturers that are, somewhere and they have some environmental considerations for their neighbors, but again, that would be an interested party in those requirements. So the expectation is the organization, as they go through these first two steps, that they've identified where are these opportunities or where are these inherent risks. So ideally, within section 4.2, we would have identified here's all these risks, and then as we put this together, we identify where do we address these within our existing management system, and if we haven't, then that's really where we've identified that risk or opportunity. So the way the standard is written is you're not required to identify or address every single risk or opportunity that you identify. There's two things we need to sort out there. The standard's only interested in only those risks or opportunities that apply to our products and services. Not that you don't want to address these others, but as it pertains to the scope of the management system, that's what the focus is on there. And then where we've prioritized those risks or opportunities, and then we have to have some method for prioritization, whether it's through a scoring mechanism, low, medium, high, red, green, yellow, some way of prioritizing those. Then all those that are really important to us, however we score that or determine that, are the ones we want to focus on. And then that's where the standard says then we need to identify those actions, and you'll see that more in section 6 of the standard. So when you get into section 4.3, it's telling us that, okay, after you've gone through the first two steps, now you know what's the scope of your services or your products that you want to offer. You want to know what markets you want to go after, and what are those additional legal requirements, industry requirements that you need to meet within that. And so that should help us to then point out what's the scope of our management system need to be. If it's just manufacturing, that could be the scope, but if we also offer services or delivery, or maybe between our products and services that includes training or some other factors, that really helps us to define what's the scope of our management system need to be. So, and that's one of the things that the standard requires that you have in the language in the standard talks about. You need to have documented information on that, maintained documented information. Prior versions of the standard used to call that document control. This version talks about maintained documented information. So the scope is one of those three areas where we absolutely have to have it defined. When we get into the quality policy, measurable objectives, those are the other two areas the standard specifically states that we have to address. And then when you get into section 4.4, that's really what it tells us, is then all those other requirements other than the first three that we need to have in place to maintain the consistency of our products and or services. So I always tell clients I work with, the first step towards continual improvement is to stabilize the process. And so for companies that I work with, some of them are maybe organizations that used to be family-owned businesses where, family members knew and they inherently knew how they work together and where the handoff of these activities are. But let's say these companies have become more successful, they're growing, now we have to add more employees, and we start to lose some of that, enhancement, that, inherent knowledge that was there. And so that tells us, okay, now how do we gain control? And so a lot of times that's the driver for some companies that want to become ISO certified, or at least use this tool to implement the standard. So obviously other reasons for companies, as you've heard me talk about before, is either, the industry they're in requires it, or their customer's requirement, or maybe even your customers required that they become certified, and we're part of that trickle-down effect. But that's really, the intent of when we get into Section 4 of the standard, Section 4.4. We've identified the scope of our management system, and now the next step is the standard says the organization shall determine those inputs required and those outputs expected from our products or services. Need to identify the sequence and interaction of our processes, so that handoff that you've heard me talk about. Need to determine and apply what's the criteria and methods that for those, for monitoring, measurement, those activities, and how do we control those processes. And then how do we make sure we have adequate resources. And again, you heard me talk about not just personnel, but infrastructure and work environment. And then how do we address those risks? Well, first of all, identification of responsibilities and authorities, and then the identification of risks. How do we handle or mitigate those? And then once we've gone through this, then we were collecting all this information. How do we pull it together as part of actionable information, and how does that drive the opportunity for improvement of your management system? So you heard me talk about these 10 different sections. The actual requirements of the standard begin with Section 4. And so if you were to read the standard, where you see the word, the organization shall, that tells us that's a requirement that needs to be addressed. If you were to read the language within the standard, where the standard talks about notes are just a clarification. They are not a requirement, but things to take into consideration as you're putting these things together as you go through this. So what we're trying to depict here, Sections 4, 5, 6, and 7 represent the planning portion of your management system. And all these standards follow that Plan, Do, Check Act. So Sections 4 through 7 are the planning. Section 8 is the doing. Section 9 is how do we check, or now how do we evaluate this information we're collecting, and then we get into Section 10, how does that drive that acting, how do we make the changes or improvements. And at a high level, that's how the standard is broken out, and that's how I would ask that you take a look at these pieces. So you heard me talk about, I make reference to value stream. So for those of you who maybe are following or implementing some lean initiatives, obviously the value stream, what are the things that bring the dollars in the door? And early on, whenever we work with companies, this is really one of the critical pieces, is to identify, what are those steps within our organization. And I always tell clients, let's label these boxes or these pieces as to, what do you call these departments? It's whatever you call those pieces. That's the first step that we want to take, is to identify, what are the departments, what are the functions, what are the steps, and then once we've done that, then what are the inputs and outputs for each of these areas. So as you can see here, talk about, from the customer, how do we capture that? That's through, RFQs, drawings, specifications, purchase orders, surveys, complaints. All those are examples of, the voice of the customer. And then we see like the brochures, proposals, contracts. Obviously, that's what sales and marketing, that's what they provide back to the customer. And then hopefully, and as you get your orders, then we really focus on, it's sales and marketing. Obviously, if they capture all the inputs from the customer, how do we make sure that we've very clearly identified those and we've captured all of those, so that as we hand that off to planning and scheduling, or if that's driving design activities, how do we make sure that those handoffs have gotten all the necessary information? And I always tell, as you heard me talk about before, if we don't get it right here, and as I put on my auditor hat, I spend a lot of time in this section here to make sure that there is, a clean identification of those requirements and a handoff of those pieces. So as an auditor, that's what they focus on, and so that's one thing we want to make sure that we understand very clearly where those handoffs occur. So again, as we get into planning and scheduling, obviously that drives, your manufacturing orders, or your, for POs or purchasing requisitions, those kinds of things, so that then as we release product for production, where's the handoff of that, raw materials, work in process, and as we get through, assembly, packaging, and then we move on to warehouse, and how do we know we have finished goods that, obviously fulfills, the shipping and receiving activities. So that's the first, step. Now, that's part of the value stream. Now, the next piece is, if the top half of this other document, or this pictorial here, represents your production-related activities, then what the color coding means is, where we capture information. So, for example, as part of purchasing, we probably want to monitor on-time delivery, the quality of products. Did we get all the supporting information and things we need? And that's part of the monitoring and measuring that we take a look at. Obviously, we have inspections and tests with production, or within our sales and marketing. And my point is, the color coding kind of represents, okay, the information that we get from these areas kind of feed into, you see the green box there that talk about, and that's really our continual improvement or data analysis requirements. It's that information, how do we look at it, put it together in an actionable way so that it identifies, do we have systemic problems that we need to initiate corrective actions on that, or how's it going to drive improvement opportunities, whether it's training or additional resources, whatever the case may be on that. But that's really what we look at, is how is that information used to drive improvement initiatives. That's all of Section 4 at a high level. So then we get into Section 5 and what's leadership's responsibility. And the very first section of that talks about, leadership shall be accountable for the management system, for providing necessary resources, for creating the quality policy, measurable objectives, making sure that the pieces are in place that drive improvement. I mean, it's really leadership's role and responsibility at a high level there. So, and that's where 5.1 talks about leadership and their requirements for their commitments. We get into Section 5.2, that's where the standard tells us that, top management or leadership's responsible for creating the quality policy. So now I'm going to kind of go back to, you heard me mention, those organizations have a strategic plan. If the pieces from identifying your SWOT analysis would fit into Section 4, or you don't necessarily have to have a strategic plan to fulfill that, but you would typically go through the SWOT analysis. But then, as part of your strategic plan, that's where organizations create their mission, their vision statements, and there should be a correlation between your mission and your vision and your quality policy. They should support one another. And within the requirements of the quality policy says that, it needs to support the organization and also be worded in a way that, that organization identify those measurable objectives. We get into Section 5.3, that's where the standard talks about, organization or leadership shall very clearly identify those responsibilities and authorities so it's very clearly understood throughout the organization. So there's a couple things there. Some organizations start with, or maybe they have a organizational chart, which can work, but we need to make sure we very clearly define who are the process owners for each of these areas, and that's really what the standard is looking for. So we identify those, and that tells us, who ultimately are the process owners for each of these other areas. We get into Section 6 of the standard. Now that really starts to drive some of the planning activities. So in Section 6.1, what it tells us there is, okay, all those things you identified in Section 4.1 and 4.2, those risks and opportunities that's been prioritized, they're saying, okay, now that these are focused on, these are the ones we need to create. What are the actions, the action plan, and the timeline for those actions to get that determined. And within 6.1, it talks about, the organization needs to prioritize those. So that's that scoring. So some risk management tools, ISO 31000 really is a guidance document for that. And if you were to implement that, there are some guidance tools where if you take, here's a risk and what's the chance that's going to happen times, the severity. So whether a company uses a 1 to 5 scoring or a 1 to 10 scoring. So what's the risk or what's the likelihood it could happen times the severity if it were to occur. And it's for the organization to determine for all those risks or opportunities that score in excess of X, then those are the ones we want to focus on. As I said before, the standard doesn't prescribe that you use 31,000, but if you have some way to prioritize, thumbs up, thumbs down, red, green, yellow, whatever works for you, some way of prioritizing that. And so those are the ones you want to focus on. So we get to Section 6.2, that's where you have the quality policy identified in section 5.3, and it's saying, okay, now, if these are the things you say are important for you as an organization, then how are you going to measure these things? So we need to make sure that we've identified those measurable objectives. Now I'm going to kind of go back again to your strategic plan. Many organizations, as part of that strategic planning process, would identify, okay, what are those key success factors for us if this is the direction we want to move to? So you identify those, and then once you've identified those key success factors, then many organizations create those key performance indicators or KPIs. So my point to you is that there should be a correlation in a lot of the organizations, and they take those KPIs to help develop those quality objectives. So the KPIs typically are at a higher level. Quality objectives might be driven down to more of a department level, but they should support one another. Again, section 6.2, that's where the standard says the organization shall maintain documented information, so you need to for sure have that defined and documented. And then section 6.3 talks about planning of changes, and you'll see changes in several sections of the standard, but in this particular section they're talking about these high-level changes, so that as an organization maybe knocks out a wall, adds on more square footage, brings in more new equipment, updates technology, those higher level changes. And the whole focus of that is to make sure, okay, if we're going to bring in this equipment, then are we going to hire or train personnel for that, which then addresses some of the requirements and resources, or if we're going to, where we talk about determining and maintaining that, so how do we make sure that if there's maintenance related activities associated with that, that we don't overlook that. And again, if there are going to be aerial work instructions or how-tos to operate that equipment or those other different processes, then how do we make sure we get those rolled into our existing management system? And that's really what this is for, is to make sure that we don't overlook the handoff of those activities into the management system. That's section 6 as a whole. We get into section 7, which is identified as support. And again, that's where we really focus on resources. And you heard me talk about there's 3 levels. Resources in terms of personnel. Do we have the right personnel? What are the requirements for personnel, the knowledge, those kinds of things. 7.1.3 talks about infrastructure. So the standard says organizations shall determine, provide, and maintain the infrastructure necessary for your products and or services, which is very openly written. And it's done that way on purpose. For example, for those environments, and I've worked in environments where we have a paint process, which obviously you have to have a controlled environment to avoid contamination and dust getting into the paint. So filtration, sometimes temperature, humidity are things you want to monitor and measure, but how do we maintain that work environment within that? So infrastructure talks about what's the equipment, how do we maintain equipment. Section 7.1.4 talks about the work environment, and again, that's specific to your products and or services as it applies to this standard. Section 7.1.5 talks about monitoring and measuring resources. So that's kind of a big area for many organizations, and I say it this way, the way the standard's written, first thing it talks about is, based upon the quality of the products and services that you provide, what are the requirements, whether it's dimensional requirements or temperature or pressure, whatever the case may be, but what are you using to monitor and measure, and what's the again, how tight of tolerances are there, and that should be the driver for obviously the selection of equipment. And that's really where the first step is. Based upon the inspections and tests that are performed, what's the equipment that needs to be done, and then where we need to have that assurance or demonstrate that assurance of our the quality of our products and services, then those pieces need to be get pulled into our, what they call, many organizations refer to as your calibration system. But what the standard talks about is, okay, you've identified all these pieces of equipment. Now you need to pull in, determine what's the frequency, how are we going to either verify or calibrate, and the standard uses those two pieces of information. Verification is we're just making sure that the piece of equipment is measuring the way it's supposed to measure, but if we have to make adjustments, then that's considered calibration. So what the standard says is, okay, for those where you have to have your inspections and tests, we need to make sure those are measuring accurately. We need to have a process for how we verify, the frequency, and how do we make those adjustments. And then there's a section of standard that talks about those requirements need to be traceable to national or international standards. So how do you maintain that traceability? So if you have a set of calipers or whatever the case, where you're using, Joe blocks or gauge blocks to verify that, then that traceability is going to be that certificate that demonstrates that they're measuring accurately. Or some organizations choose to outsource that, and so that traceability would be that certificate that's provided by your calibration lab. Both of those would help to demonstrate that. And then the standard says that, well, where there is no traceability, then the organization needs to demonstrate and document or define its method for that verification or calibration activities. And then the last step tells us that, we need to maintain records, and if we identify pieces of equipment that are outside of their calibration accuracy, meaning that, okay, we're calibrating this piece of equipment or these pieces of equipment, whether it's semi-annually, annually, whatever the frequency is that you determine, and now it's not measuring. Now the standard says, okay, now we have to assess the validity of those prior measurement results, which tells us, okay, did we potentially let product get out the door, or did we have another inspection and test somewhere down the line that would have detected if that was not measuring accurately, and therefore we've mitigated that risk. But that's what the standard's telling us. We have to do that evaluation, and we need to maintain records of that evaluation. All of that's required as part of that monitoring and measuring resources. We move on to section 716. It talks about organizational knowledge, and that's telling us that, okay, we need to inventory and evaluate what's the level of organizational knowledge for all of those folks that affect our products and or services. So we perform that inventory, and so rather than we talk about competency, but I like to refer to that as what are the skill set requirements for folks in these areas. So that's telling us we need to not only identify that, but we need to periodically, how do we update that information as either technology changes or we recognize, a shift in, our requirements for competency of our employees, but, how do we monitor and maintain that? Which gets into competence, section 7.2. Competence really starts with, first step is that the organization, however you have your departments, and within your departments, if you have operators or lead personnel or area supervisors, what are the skill set requirements for each of those levels within each of those departments? So the first step is to identify what are those competency requirements. The next step is then, once you've identified those, then what's our process for either providing the training or sending folks outward to get certified, or perhaps just on-the-job training, or maybe we're just going to do some testing, but how do we impart that? And so that's the next piece. So as an auditor, I go in and somebody tells me, I ask for the competency requirements. Then they maybe show me some of the training records that's been done. The next question I ask is, okay, what's going to be the evidence that we've achieved the competence that we were seeking? And that's really what the standards tell us. Beyond the training, what do we do, or how do we determine that competency has been achieved? And so we need to make sure we have the evidence to demonstrate that as well. And so that leads into the last piece in that section that tells us then we need to maintain the appropriate records demonstrating that competency. In addition to that, the next step is awareness. That's where the standard's telling us that, way back here, whenever we created the quality policy and the measurable objectives, that's telling us that personnel, wherever they work, need to be aware of those of the quality policy and those measurable objectives that they influence in their role. So if I work in engineering, or if I work in purchasing, or if I work in production, whatever those monitoring and measuring, objectives, goals, objectives we have, how do I influence those? And as an auditor, so usually as I'm auditing folks, interviewing folks, whether it's in production, these other areas, at some point I'm going to ask, by the way, are you aware of the quality policy? And I would expect that they could echo the essence of what that is. And then somewhere there, I would ask, okay, so which objectives do you influence in your role here in purchasing or whatever department may be? And I would expect that they could demonstrate or echo or tell me how they influence that. And then one of the last questions I'll ask is, how are you currently performing? Which implies that, we are posting that. If we, have monthly goals for scrap and rework, or production, or on-time delivery, or customer satisfaction, and, so I would expect to see those posted so we know just exactly how we're performing. And that's what an auditor looks at or looks for. So that's the awareness, and then communication really is just, it's up for the organization to determine all those communication methods throughout the organization to convey this, whether it's the quality management system requirements or some of these measurable objectives. A lot of those, we just need to define where that's at. which gets into section 7.5 is the last section, documented information. Prior versions of the standard used to call this document records control, but it's really, all those things that make up our management system need to be controlled, and that really define you. We need to define the process for how do we determine, how do we evaluate, review those documents, how do we control them, whether they're controlled by revision letter, whether they're controlled by revision number. Are we maintaining these documents electronically or in hard copy or some hybrid form? But all of those, how do we make sure we're using the right version of those and they're at the right location? And then it talks about then retain documented information, which happens to be the record side. And we have to have methods in place for how we secure those, how we retain those, and how do we make sure that none of that's been tampered with or that they've somehow been inadvertently compromised. So we have to have those pieces in place. And that's what section 7.5 represents. This is just really kind of, most organizations outline or define their documents in these 4 levels. Level 1 tends to be your manual level document. Very high level really just kind of explains this is our manual, and then points to those supporting documents that explains in more detail how we fulfill those requirements. Level 2 documents are procedures. There's no real official rule book, there's guidance documents, but the difference between procedures and work instructions, as I explain it, is procedures cross functional boundaries. An example, document control is required as much in purchasing as it is in engineering, as it is in production, so it crosses all those functional boundaries, whereas work instructions tend to be job specific, task specific, operator specific, machine specific how-tos. So that would be as I'm trying to determine what level of document this is, that's really kind of how I sort those 2 out. And then forms really are, we know where we have to maintain records, where we document those records. So those forms, before they're filled out, are a document, but once they're populated and now we're archiving that information and become records, it's just a reminder of here's the information that we need to collect and retain, and that's really that level 4 of those forms documents. But it's all of those pieces in their entirety that make up our management system, and it's all of those pieces that need to be controlled as part of that section 7.5 of the standard. All right, that's all of section 7. I haven't seen any questions yet. I hope I'm providing you some useful information. Section 8 tends to be the longest section, and those are the things that bring the dollars in the door that we can talk about. All right, so when we get into section 8.1, that's really at a high level the overall planning for all the things that happens within your production and servicing activities. So part of the planning includes how do we determine product and service requirements? How do we establish the criteria or processes for controlling those processes? What are the requirements for product and service acceptance, whether those dimensional requirements, plus what are the acceptable tolerance range, and then how do we implement process control of those processes, whether it's within a particular range, within a certain feed rate or temperature. All those would be those parameters that we need to maintain to control that. And then what is the documented information that we need to make sure is available, whether you call them work orders or job packets or pick tickets. All those are examples of those planning activities. And then the standard says that the output of planning shall be in a format that's suitable for the organization. So that's where I ask organizations, okay, what would be the output of your planning? So if you tell me it's my design drawings, it's my purchase requisitions, or my purchase documents and those POs and the information in those, it's the work orders that we release, that really should be the output of all your planning activities. And that's really kind of section 8.1 in a whole, at a high level. Whoops, let me back up here. When we get to section 8.2, where it talks about requirements for products and services or those customer related activities. The first section talks about, what's the information or processes we have for providing information to our customers, whether it's brochures, and if those brochures, outline, performance criteria for our products, then we want to make sure we control those. Our website, again, if we have performance criteria for how our products or services work or things, we need to control that information so we make sure that customers are making their purchases or their decisions based upon accurate information. How do we handle quotes? How do we handle orders? All that's a part of things. And then there's another section in there is how do we handle contingency plans where necessary? So some organizations or some customers have this requirement for contingency plans, and so we need to make sure we get that portion addressed as well. So that's section 8.2.1. When we get to section 8.2.2, that's really we get into the contracts and how we fulfill those contracts. So the first step is that 8.2.2 is how do we determine those requirements? And that's the first step for, how do we capture that? How do we define that so it's very clearly understood? And that would not only be the requirements by the customer, maybe information that we need to collect to be able to accurately provide our products and services, any statutory, regulatory requirements that we need to make sure that we address, but it's determining all those pieces there. So that when you get into section 8.2.3, it says the organization needs to have these formal reviews in 3 different areas: before we quote, upon acceptance of an order, or we have an amendment to an existing contract. So the expectation is, okay, we have a formal review where we quote, and then we've submitted the quote, customer's given us an order, we want to compare what the order to the quote to make sure it's accurate. The standard states then if there's any discrepancies, we need to get that cleared up with the customer. And then where we have amendments to contracts, then how do we handle those amendments for a couple reasons? One is, we can't just say, sure, we'll make those changes, and then as we look at where we're at in production, maybe we've already produced some of the parts, and now as a result of the changes, we're going to have to rework or scrap or remake some of these things. Obviously, that could affect the timeline, probably going to affect the cost. So that's where the standard's saying we should expect to see a formal review, and that's what auditors look at. As I'm interviewing folks in contract review, I ask, do you ever have customers that make changes? And many times I'll get, well, sure, we just got one just today or yesterday. Then, of course, as an auditor, now my expectation is, show me the records of that review of where we handled those changes. Now, the next step of that is, as part of those changes, how do we make sure that we update the necessary documentation, whether it's purchasing documents, whether it's the work order or the shop orders or things, so that those folks have gotten the updated information. And again, we need to have records of those pieces. As much for our own protection, and I say it that way because maybe your customer isn't necessarily ISO certified, and so purchasing gets a hold of you, you make these changes. If you don't have records of these changes, all of a sudden you ship the product out, and this happens a lot. It goes to your customer's back door, and the receiving inspection wasn't made aware of these changes, and now they're telling that you just shipped them non-conforming product. So again, this formal record, maintaining these or retaining these records is as much for our protection as it is for holding our customers accountable for those pieces as well. Now, so that gets through all the contract review. Section 8.3 talks about design development activities, and design development, general requirements just at a high level, that we have a process, that we clearly identify the stages of design and development, that we could very clearly assign then responsibilities and authorities, and that we include the appropriate personnel at as part of the design development. So the expectation there is it's not just the engineering department. It's going to be where quality is involved, where the customer is involved, where production is involved with some of these design activities. So that's the first step. Then you get into design development planning, and that's where you've put together these processes. Section 8.3.3 talks about design development inputs. And so very clearly, each of these sections tells us we have to have records. We talk about design development inputs. Each organization needs to clearly identify those inputs for design development. And a lot of that comes from the customer as part of section 8.2, where we're determining the requirements. So we've identified very clearly what are those input requirements. And then you get to 8.3.4, design development controls, and so that's all the controls in place. That includes verification activities, validation activities, and so to make sure we understand the difference between the two, verification activities would be considered in a simulated environment. Have we fulfilled those input requirements? Now that could be as simple as I have a drawing that fulfills those requirements. That could be a simulated. Some organizations may have prototypes. Not necessarily all the prototypes are a verification. It could be the validation too if we're building and designing and building these one-off products. But again, validation again is in a simulated environment. Have we met those input requirements. Validation is okay in the real world. Is that, have we fulfilled those design development requirements? Is the end product fulfilling and producing and doing things the way that it should be, the way we designed that? So that's where we've validated those activities. Which gets us into section 835, and it talks about design development outputs. So the expectation there is that for every design input, we clearly demonstrate we have an output that is satisfied that design input requirements, and that very simply is really what the standard's telling us. So we need to make sure we've clearly identified the inputs and we've clearly identified an output, and that's what auditors look at or look for. 836 talks about what happens when we have changes, whether we're the ones, we're designing our own products and we're administering those changes, or whether we're designing and building products for customers and they facilitate changes. Again, how do we handle that? And as part of the change, some of the language talks about, again, we need to determine those inputs, those outputs, and again, what's going to represent verification and validation. So a lot of times it's going to be, here's the existing design, and then we just need to make these other tweaks or adjustments or changes, and that would then limit the verification validation activities would be limited only to where those changes are made. That's design in its entirety there. We get into section 8.4, and that's where we get into control of externally provided processes, products, and services. Prior versions of the standard, most of the folks kind of really focused on those raw materials and components that come in the door. How do we make sure that we select suppliers that can provide those, that ship us good stuff on time, and all the supporting, C of A's, CFCs, those things that we require. This version of standard has kind of expanded that. Certainly those suppliers or those external providers are a part of that. The next section talks about that would include then those external providers that would act on behalf of the organization. What does that mean? So I've worked with maybe a client that designs and builds trailers that travel all across the nation. And they have warranty, and they also may provide services, but they don't necessarily have the capability or the resources to cover somebody if a trailer breaks down or needs maintenance in another part of the country. So that's where they have to go through a formal process for how to identify those resources that are going to act on behalf of me and provide or take care of those maintenance activities, whether, again, like I said, whether it's warranty related or otherwise. So we have to, so that selection and evaluation, it would be extended to those folks as well. And then there's the last category of external providers, which would be those processes that the organization that we have chosen to outsource, which would include such things as, the calibration lab we use. If we outsource some of our maintenance activities that could impact our products or services, meaning the equipment that's being used. Other things that would be included when they talk about this would include where most organizations do things electronically, and it includes IT related things, backups. How do we facilitate patches or updates? Again, if that's outsourced, how do we select, how do we evaluate, monitor, and measure all of these folks? This is the first step. And the standard says we have to have a process or method for the initial selection and the ongoing evaluation of those suppliers. And then it tells us that we have to have records on the performance of those and any actions that's provided. The next, so that's that type and extent of control. Talks about then what do we have in terms of incoming inspection. So, depending upon the critical nature of the incoming product, that's going to determine where do we receive product just by verifying I got the right type, I got the right quantity. Physically, there's no visual damage. There's some things we can accept with only those inspection test activities. There are other things that maybe we want to take some dimensional tests, do some kind of incoming monitoring and measuring, or where we require C of A's or C of C's, then we need to make sure that information will come along with the incoming products, raw materials or components. And the expectation is that if we're expecting those and we've called out or required those, somebody's taking a look at that information to make sure that it fulfills those requirements. And then, of course, where we've identified either suspect or non-conforming product, how do we tag it, how do we segregate it, and how does that fall into our control and non-conforming product process. Then, so information for external providers is, again, making sure that we have all the information that that's necessary we have the level of detail. So let's say we outsource welding and we want certified welders. We want to make sure that that's very clearly defined. If we expect, again, as I said, the C of A's, C of C's, all that needs to be very clearly on our purchasing documents. And I say purchasing documents, whether it's a contract, whether it's a purchase order, whatever we release to our suppliers. And then there's a section of the standard that says that it needs to be reviewed for adequacy before it's being released to our external providers. So that's section 8.4. We get to section 8.5, those are the production-related activities. So the things that happen in section 8.1, where the standard states that the output of planning shall be in a format that's acceptable to or that fulfills customer the requirements, that's where I'd be looking for, again, whether releasing to work orders or job packets or whatever we want to call those. But those work order, those job packets includes, what's the product that I'm producing? What's the part I'm producing? What are the dimensional requirements? That we have the inspection and testing, that we have qualified personnel. All those things are part of that control of that product and service provision. There's another piece within that product and service provision that talks about how do we control special processes. So where we have special processes, we need to validate those processes. Special processes would be considered such things as painting, plating, heat treating, adhesion, encapsulation, non-destruct testing. Those are all considered special processes. And where we have those, then we have to have some method for how we validate those activities. One would be if we use certified welders, then that certificate would be one way of validating that. And that's where obviously the welders put together a coupon, send it out, they do destruct analysis, and if it meets that criteria, then that's where they get that certification as a welder. For painters, depending upon whether they're mil specs or how it needs to be applied, then that would be the driver for how we qualify our paint process. And so it's usually a combination of following the process and also making sure that the operator is following those activities. So there's a lot more stringent requirements in terms of some of the paint processes. Plating would be another one of those areas. But again, part of validating, if we outsource plating and we require that C of A, C of C, that could be considered validation for the outsourced process, whether it's painting, plating, or whatever the case may be. So that's part of, again, those special processes. And what makes it a special process is, there's no inspection and test that would tell us immediately whether it's good, meaning that I might be able to put together a bead on a weld that looks like it's a good weld, but if I don't get the right temperature or the right penetration, then somewhere down the road, whether it's before it leaves my facility, that weld might crack, or somewhere down the road. And so, whereas if I have a good weld, then the material is going to give away before that weld would give away. So again, because I don't have any pass-fail test I can take. I mean, you can take some X-ray analysis and such, but again, that's what qualifies it as a special process. So that's section 851. 852 is ID traceability. ID and traceability is expected throughout, as part of incoming inspection, your raw materials components, how those identified. As we release for production, then that traceability is going to be to that work order or the job number. And so I would expect to see, all the, raw materials components associated with that job. There should be some information associated with that. That section of the standard also talks about status. So if I'm going through production, and if I'm the auditor, and I'm walking through and I see, I usually, as I interview operators, I ask, walk me through the process, where are you at in this step, and maybe here's a sequence of activities, there's a list, 7 or 8 activities, and they tell me they're at step 5 or whatever the case may be, then I would expect to see where's the sign-offs that show or demonstrate that, sections, the first 4 steps have been fulfilled. If I see that there's blanks or things haven't been signed off, that would be a non-conforming or example of a non-conformity. But again, that demonstrates the status of work in process. And then, of course, final inspection. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that where we talk about release of products. But again, what's going to represent evidence of the final inspection and stuff, so I understand traceability. So if it moves into finished goods, how do we identify those very clearly? So again, I understand very clearly the identification, traceability, and the status of what these pieces are. If I see raw materials, and a lot of times this is what I find, especially for companies just beginning, I see a lot of maybe some scrap or rework or drop off that's under shelves and kind of stuffed away. And as I walk through, I'll say, well, what's that? What's the job for that? Or what does that belong to? And that's what I'm looking for, is to make sure that everything is very clearly identified. Section 853 talks about property belonging to customers or external providers. So where maybe the customer ships us, we incorporate some of their product, so the customer-owned product into our manufacturing processes. Then where we receive that, how do we identify it? How do we handle it, safeguard it to make sure it's not damaged? And then the standard talks about then if there's some product that's been damaged or is unsuitable for use, then how do we tag it? How do we notify the customer? And how do we maintain records of that? This version of the standard extended that also to external providers. One example is I worked for or with a company that manufactured paper products, and so they would get these huge rolls of product in. Well, they had a warehouse that they maintained. It was on consignment, so their supplier provided it to them, and they didn't take ownership of that until they pulled it from the warehouse and brought it in for production. Again, the same premise applies. How do we identify it? How do we safeguard it? And then if for whatever reason it's damaged or considered unusable, then how do we notify our external provider and maintain those records? So that's what that section of the standard tells us. Preservation, 854, that's obviously preservation throughout, from incoming material all the way through finished goods. Preservation includes handling, storage, packaging, preservation all the way through delivery. Would also include if we have shelf life items, how do we tag those in such a way then, once they're expired, then how do we identify those as non-conforming products so we don't use it, and how do we discard those pieces? In addition to that would be, if we have items that are either temperature sensitive, those kinds of things, how do we safeguard and handle those appropriately? And that's what Section 854 talks about. Post-delivery activities. Post-delivery activities for many organizations would be at a minimum where we have warranty issues. So those activities that happen beyond the initial contract. Some organizations have, provide services or maintenance activities after production. All those are examples of post-delivery activities. So where that applies, then that we would make sure that we include that. And then 856 talks about control of changes. That would be if we make changes in the sequence of activities in our production, in the router, those kinds of things, then we have to have records of, there's expectation that we've had a review of the result of those changes and who authorized the change, and then any adjustments or things that happen as a result of the outcome. Those are records of that. That starts to get into configuration management, which isn't specifically listed as part of this standard, but if you were to get into AS 9100 or automotive or medical device, then that configuration management starts to become much more significant. But that's what that's telling us about there. We get into Section 8.6, release of products and services. That's, after things have gone through production and or servicing, then that just tells us, that product shall not proceed until all those activities have been performed, all the inspections and tests have been performed, and we have all the records of who released the product and the results of that, the inspections and testing. All that is part of the records before it's released. So that would be, if we have production routers, that could be the evidence there. Could be the pick ticket where we pull from a warehouse, but or a combination of those activities would be that evidence of release of products and services. And then Section 8.7 is, obviously where we have inspections and tests, then what happens if something doesn't meet those requirements, and how do we tag it? How do we segregate it? We have to have a process in place for how do we disposition, whether it's scrap, rework, use as is with concession. Where we rework, we have to re-inspect, and then there's records requirements for what was the non-conformity, what was the corrective action, and who released that. So those are the pieces there. So, and the reason why that the records are there is where we have all these monitoring and measuring, that's all the stuff that feeds into Section 9 of the standard, which is part of the evaluation of the performance of our management system. So, Section 9.1 tells us at a high level, monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. At a high level, this says the organization shall determine monitoring and measurement and the analysis and evaluation of their activities, and leaves it fairly open-ended. But then you get into, so we get to 9.1.2, specifically tells us we have to monitor customer satisfaction. And the language in there tells us we have to monitor the customer's perception of satisfaction, and then we need to determine what are those methods, whether it's a survey, whether we measure on-time delivery, whether we measure product returns, lost business analysis. There's really a notes section, and that kind of gives you an outline of the various things that would satisfy or meet those requirements. And most organizations have 2 or 3 different ways of how they monitor the customer's perception of satisfaction. Section 913 talks about evaluation and analysis. That's really the output of section 9.1. So it gets much more prescriptive and tell us here's all these things that we need to make sure we monitor as part of that. So part of that would include obviously the inspections and tests of our products and services that we perform. It would be, certainly we'd be looking at our non-conforming product to see are there any trends that's recognizable to either maybe operator training needs or equipment maintenance needs, or whether we see there's improvement initiatives or areas where we can focus some of those improvement initiatives as a result of the heightened non-conformities. Would also include results of customer satisfaction, the results of our processes or our internal audits. All of those pieces are a requirement for that analysis and evaluation. So a lot of things that, or actually all the things that are inputs for 913 really are a part of the inputs for management review activities, just so that you know. So sections 9.1, 9.1.3, and 9.3 are very interrelated, and a lot of times when we put those together, we demonstrate how those are interrelated within one document to kind of help streamline that piece. Section 9.2 talks about internal audits. It says the organization shall perform internal audits at prescribed or scheduled intervals, but it doesn't get prescriptive in terms of what those intervals are. So if we were to say, it says that based upon the status of the process, the importance of the process, prior audit results, a lot of those things are go into how we determine the frequency or how we prioritize or schedule those audits. So we can't just say, look, we perform audits annually, every process annually. That wouldn't satisfy the intent of the standard. And so typically we want to look at the results of those audits to see where we had problem areas, or if we recently expanded to a different product line or different equipment or other things, then those would be indicators for why we'd want to audit more frequently until the evidence demonstrates that that's a controlled process. I always tell clients that it's not just a one-way street, where here's these areas where maybe we need to have more frequent audits, but also if we have areas where we've audited, maybe gone to 3 or 4 rounds of audits and there's been no non-conformities identified, then we could use that to justify or substantiate when we want to relax maybe from 12 months to 18 months in a particular process audit that we would conduct. Which gets into section 9.3, management review. There's a list of management review inputs that have to be covered. Part of that includes section 4.1 and 4.2, because those sections of the standard say that the organization shall monitor information related to that. So the expectation is where we've identified those risks and or opportunities, those actions, we're going to want to take a look at those to see, have those changed? Has the nature of the industry, have we moved into new industries? Do we have different customers that have different interested party requirements or industry requirements, or has there been any changes or updates in perhaps OSHA requirements, or those kinds of things that we need to be sensitive to? And so those are part of the management review input activities. Also, we will look at control and non-conforming product, results of our process and product performance activities. Other things we'd look at, you heard me talk about internal audits, customer satisfaction, again, all those. And then after having reviewed all those pieces, then it says, that we need to record, also would be any resource requirements or improvement needs. As a result of that, any actions need to be recorded, and then so that then the next management review, the very first things we want to look at actions from the prior management review just to make sure that nothing fell through the cracks. All of those are part of the management review activities, and then from that, then we would identify any improvement initiatives or corrective actions which makes their way into Section 10 of the standard. Section 10 of the standard just in general talks about what are those pieces that would constitute improvement, and it's be the management reviews, corrective actions, results audits, all those things that's just mentioned. And then where we've identified improvement opportunities, then that Section 10.2 talks about nonconformity and corrective action. So within nonconformity and corrective action, the standard really tells us the first steps are, what are the immediate steps to, either mitigate it. What do we do to fix the immediate problem? Did we replace it? Did we scrap it? How did we bring it in? And then we make a determination then based upon the severity, it evolves into a corrective action. So if it becomes a corrective action, then you would to perform cause analysis, root cause analysis, and based upon the cause or causes would include, has this non-conforming condition happened otherwhere, or could it potentially happen elsewhere, so that we really get to true root cause. And then based upon that, the cause or causes, then that should drive the actions that we put into place. And so we list those actions, but we can't close that out after we've conducted or performed all those actions. The next step would be only until we followed up and did we get the intended outcome of those actions. So we look at the results of actions. So not only did we verify 1, 2, 3 steps that we put in place as those actions, but then I'd also look at some evidence that shows, okay, I looked at a series of jobs or whatever that, some sort of period of information, and did that not reoccur? And if the evidence suggests that it didn't reoccur, then that tells me it was effective, I can close it out, or if I'm still having the problem, I can't close it out. So that's really what corrective action tells us. Then that gets into Section 10.3, which just tells us that the organization shall have these improvement initiatives. So outside of corrective actions, maybe we have other improvement initiatives that aren't corrective in nature. Then we should also want to take credit for that or capture that information and track that as well. So that is all the standard in its entirety at a high level. So I know it was a lot of information in a short period of time. I hope that part was useful. Now let's talk a little bit about registration. So the way, whenever we look for a certification body, then there's actually a website, anab.org, that is really, ANAB oversees the accreditation of those certification bodies. So much like ourselves, the certification bodies that audit us, they are also audited because there's an ISO standard that they are audited to. And ANAB happens to be the accreditation body that audits those certification bodies. And so what that tells us, and there's this couple of documents, ISO 17025 and 17021, but basically it explains to us that based upon the number of employees, number of facilities, somewhat the square footage, all of that really kind of determines the number of what they refer to as man days that is necessary for certification for that facility or for those facilities. And there's a guidance document that tells us the number of man days. And the reason why that's there is so that certification bodies don't get into a bidding war. And so if one certification body says it's going to take 4 days and then another one says, well, I can do it in 3, and now all of a sudden we've compromised the integrity of that third-party certification. For that reason, that's why they have this schedule. And so then what happens then, we get the quote, we decide who we want to use. As part of that selection process, I always tell clients, maybe you want to start with ISO 9001, but if you foresee down the road you're going to maybe want to or need to upgrade to the medical requirements of 13485, or to the aviation, space, and defense requirements of AS 9100, or to automotive IAT of 16949, then you probably want to select a certification body that also performs those certifications as well, so that in the event you upgrade, you don't have to completely change over to a new or different certification body. So that should be a part of your criteria for consideration. So whenever organizations come out, the first thing a certification body does, they have this stage 1 audit that they conduct. And at the stage 1 audit, what they look to see is that the organization has performed a full round of internal audits plus a formal management review. They'll also take a look at your non-conforming product process to make sure it's in place, in your corrective action process to make sure you're getting to true root cause. And then what happens is, as part of that stage 1 audit, they make sure, does the scope of your management system make sense? Are there no disconnects? And do you have these pieces in place that demonstrate or have evidence that the system has been in place? And then at the end of the stage 1, which is a day long, then they'll say, based upon the evidence, then I recommend that your company moves forward for the stage 2 audit, which is typically 4 weeks later. So at the stage 2 audit, unlike the stage 1 audit now, they've verified that you fulfilled the minimum requirements of the ISO standard. At the stage 2 audit, now they're auditing you to your documents to make sure you're following your processes. And again, that's over the course of that, they collect their audit evidence. At the end of that, then they can either make a recommendation for certification, or based upon the evidence, they cannot make a recommendation for certification. As part of the ISO 9000 standard, you can have some minor nonconformities. Minor nonconformities would be like an isolated incident of, let's say, maybe I have a supplier that I didn't get evaluated within the 12-month period, or whatever the case may be. Or, we have some evidence that something like that, an isolated incident that didn't cause non-conforming product to go out the door. Those are considered like minor nonconformities. Major nonconformities, an organization cannot be recommended for certification if you have any major nonconformities. So typically what would happen is, the difference is if you have minor nonconformities, you have 30 days to submit a plan. If the plan makes sense, it gets integrated into your corrective action process. If your auditor then accepts your proposed corrective action, then what they'll do is at the next surveillance audit, then they'll follow up on that to make sure that it got closed out and everything's in check there. Whereas if you have a major nonconformity, typically you have to have a plan in place and implemented, then they usually come back on site to verify that you've got these in place and that's been taken care of. So that's really kind of the difference between the major and minor for the initial audit. So then we talk about surveillance audits. You get past the initial certification audit. Most certification bodies now just go to annual surveillance audits. There are some that would do semi-annual surveillance audits. I used to, in the beginning, recommend organizations just starting would go to a semi-annual surveillance audit just so that they don't get in the habit of these processes. And for a certification body, if your surveillance audits were scheduled for 2 man days a year, they would typically, for 6 months, they would do 1 day at 6 months and 1 at the 12-month mark. But now most of them are just going to the annual surveillance audits. And your certificate is typically good for 3 years, and they have these surveillance audits. After the 3rd year, then they have to go through another full-blown certification audit, and that's how the registration process works. Again, things that come into certification process, you heard me talk about the size, the scope, number of employees, the extent of documentation. So, the amount of documentation is going to differ from one organization to the next. Things that come into play. If I bring in temporary employees, from temp agencies and such, then obviously I'm going to expect that we have a lot of either pictorials or how-tos. So how do we quickly ramp up those employees so that they're producing good product? Typically, it would be a driver for more extensive documentation, or depending upon the how difficult or how some processes or obviously more detailed require a heightened level of training and or experience, then that might be one indicator. Now, another indicator would be, for example, like a tool and die shop. Most tool and die shops have very experienced employees or operators that's been, like a minimum of 10 years or some sort of, background demonstrating that. And so where we have that level of competency, that might reduce the amount of documentation that we would need for that. But all of those are considerations for the amount of documentation. You heard me talk about the scope and the management system. Some organizations I've worked with, we have 15 facilities covered under one certificate. That would be the scope of the certification. I've also had and worked with companies that each organization, if they maybe have 3 or 4 different entities and each one is responsible for their own certification, that is a different way. But I mean, either which way, that's workable within the scope of your management system, but you've got to determine that as well. So, other things, pre-audit, that's not a requirement. Some organizations like to have a pre-assessment conducted by the certification body just so they have a dry run to see how they would see or look at things. Again, it's optional, it's not a requirement, but that's in addition to or separate of the stage 1 activities. You heard me talk about the stage 2 activities. And again, at the end of that, they can either make a recommendation for certification or they cannot make a recommendation for certification. Because, as I told you before, they have to submit their paperwork to the certification body, who typically has a board who reviews it to make sure that all the evidence has been collected that's required. Because when A&AB comes out and they conduct their audits, if they see that there are these certifications and they're missing some of their required information, they can kick those audits out. And what they want to do is make sure that the auditor doesn't have to give you a call and say, hey, I've got to come back and finish my audit. I didn't cover everything, so that's why they can only make a recommendation. And it goes to that board just to help safeguard that. And I've not seen any situation where those have been kicked out, but I know that that's happened. But just to let you know why they make a recommendation. After registration, typically your costs, 60% of your costs happen in the initial certification, and the others are really kind of separated out as they do their surveillance audits. You heard me talk about the frequency of surveillance audits. They will always, as part of surveillance audits, look at your internal audits, look at non-conforming product, corrective actions, and management review requirements, every part of that. Then the remainder of those requirements, then they will break that out and separate that out over the course of the 3 years so that they cover all those processes within that. So things that they also look at, of course, results of prior corrective actions, areas where we had nonconformities, and they want to make sure that, that we've got the true root cause and that those pieces have been put in place. Now, one thing that I neglected to say in the very beginning is when we talk about the scope of certification, the standard says, that for organizations, all of the requirements of the standard apply unless they aren't performed there, meaning that if, as an organization, we manufacture product, but let's say we don't design our own product, we produce to customer designs only, well then that's considered what is a non-applicable area. So that's one example. Another one would be maybe purchasing happens at a corporate facility and we receive it, and then we obviously we inspect it and handle it from that point, but maybe purchasing and that supplier selection happens at the corporate entity, then that could be considered a non-applicable area. So those are examples of what non-applicable areas are. And so the scope of your management would clearly need to detail those non-applicable areas and a description as to why they're not. We can't just state this is a non-applicable area because we don't want to have to abide by that section of the standard. If it's inherent within our the scope of our management system, then it belongs and it needs to be included. Other things, keeping registration. Avoid serious nonconformities. Obviously, you can get major nonconformities if you have significant, depending upon the significance. If we send out a lot of product that's nonconforming, that's a real easy way to get a major nonconformity. Misuse of registration logo or documents. So again, we cannot say that our products are ISO certified, only our organization or management system is. Also, we cannot, where organizations may have several locations, but only one or two of them are actually certified, we need to make sure that the scope of how we use that registration or the logo is specific to those locations that apply. I've seen examples of organizations that try to extend that. Certification body finds out and they will take away or your certification if that is to occur. So that's that violation of other serious rules or things that need to be taken into consideration. So this is just talking about, beyond certification, the maturity of organizations. You're gone from, we say, a no formal approach or no recognized approach to, most organizations are become more reactive. And so as I see organizations evolve, in the beginning I'm going to see more corrective actions, but as your system matures, I expect to see more stable approach in that things are being more proactively addressed and less of a reactive way. And so that's really where we start to see that continual improvement and where the organization has really embraced those requirements. And so that gets you to that section 4, that fourth step, continual improvement is emphasized, and then, you know, obviously that best in class is what we want to evolve to. So ASQ recently had a study that they conducted, American Society for Quality. For those of us in the quality field, that's kind of the recognized entity. But there was this study that said for every dollar spent on an organization's management system, quality management system, the evidence suggested that there would be $6 or 6 to 1 in additional revenue that's been obtained, $16 reduction in costs, $3 increased profits, and on average then the management recognized reduced overall costs by 4.8%. That's not my numbers, that comes from a study. There were some other studies that were included, but I just included this one just to give you some sense of what should I be able to expect on my return on investment. This is just a list of, you know, beyond ISO 9001, you heard me talk about, I work with many companies that maybe we started at ISO 9001, and then as time went on, they've been asked by a customer or decided to move into other industries where they need to upgrade to meet some of these other IATF 16949 for the automotive industry. Aviation, space, and defense has these. AS 9100 applies for manufacturers, 9110 for maintenance, repair, and overhaul. 9120 is for those distributors, but those are also additional requirements. Medical devices, ISO 13485. Healthcare has this international workforce agreement. TL 9000 for telecommunication. Food safety is a fairly recent one, and there's one of 3 standards. The FSSC 22000, BRC, SQF. For environmental, ISO 14001. Occupational health and safety, 45001, information security, 27,000, energy. All of these are derivations, all of them except for medical devices broken into that 10 phase. So the good news is if you need to update or upgrade to those, it's going to include all those 9001 requirements and then those additional, what they call industry or sector specific requirements. So, the next step beyond that, I always tell clients, you know, once you become recommended for certification, that's the end of the beginning. And what I mean by that is, you know, you've absorbed these costs to demonstrate that you fulfill these requirements for your customers. Now the next layer of improvements should be, how do we increase the quality of our products or the efficiency so that now we can start to add more, you know, profitability, more to the bottom line. So, you know, the worst thing we can do is to maybe implement some of these, you know, like lean initiatives or some of these other initiatives, and really don't roll that into or integrate that as part of our management system requirements. I've seen organizations that take on these initiatives and now embrace some lean and made some changes and removing non-value added activities, but they fail to make the updates as part of their management system. Then their certification body comes on site, they see there's a disconnect and they write a non-conformity. So we just want to make sure we avoid that. But the more important piece is those organizations that integrate these initiatives will see exponentially greater improvement because, again, it's focused on the overall strategic direction of the organization. So what makes those more successful? You know, obviously practices for implementing those include, you know, that committed leadership, cross-functional training, employee involvement. All those, you know, are initiatives that you would recognize. So again, the practice being implemented should be compatible and directed towards consistent improvement goals. Successful companies, they integrate those improvement initiatives, extend, support your strategic direction, and the integration requires effective project management. This is just an outline that explains, you know, if I have a strategic plan or even the outcome of that strategic plan really is going to be, you know, we identify those KPIs that become our quality policy and our measurable objectives. And so those should be integrated and the driver for. And then you see on that bottom box, again, you may start with an ISO 9001 system or a conforming system, then you become certified, and then you may want to upgrade or integrate one of these additional requirements to the standard. And then beyond that, you know, that's where these other improvement initiatives, whether it's workforce development, continual improvement, or supplier or supply chain development, all those should support these activities in your quest towards world-class status. So next steps. Again, the first step would be, if this hasn't scared you off, and you are focused on wanting to become certified, then these would be the next steps that I would encourage. Whether you conduct the gap analysis or you have somebody do that for you, but that's, some organizations say, well, I think I'm a little bit closer to certification than a lot of companies. That's where it would make sense to start with a gap analysis, so then you can put together an implementation plan for you. Other organizations maybe come to me and they say, Kurt, I know that we don't meet those requirements, and so I would say, why do we need to conduct a gap analysis, save your money, and let's put together a plan and get started. So then obviously we need to make sure that folks have been provided the appropriate training so that they're aware of the requirements of the standard and have that clear understanding of those requirements. And then if you have your existing management system, some organizations, most organizations have some sense of a management system, but again, update those to make sure you meet those requirements. And then again, obviously at some point, contact your certification body or identify one that you want to work with. Products and services that we offer. We provide gap analysis for clients, do overview, internal audit training. We have some clients we work with that actually contract us to perform their internal audits. I work with a number of companies from start to finish to, how do we go through all the way to successful certification. And we put together a plan and a timeline and milestones for that. Management review activities, continual improvement initiatives, maybe retraining of auditors, or where we've had some problem areas, focus on that. Those are all things that we do as part of these activities. So that covers everything that I promised I would cover, and I haven't heard any questions. I've got 15 minutes to field any and all questions that you may have.